All right, thrust into the big world of activism by the largest school shooting in American history, Parkland survivor David Hogg has become one of the most compelling voices of his generation. His call to get over politics and get something done challenges Americans to stand up, speak out, and work to elect morally just leaders, regardless of party affiliation. David's eloquent responses to Americans' largest school shooting immediately placed him in the national and international media spotlight. Committed to becoming an agent for change, he resolved that no other young person should have to experience the tragic impact of gun violence. He joined friends from high school to co found March for Our Lives, now one of the largest youth led movements. 5 weeks after the shooting, March for Our Lives mobilized one of the biggest demonstrations in American history. Speaking before an estimated 800,000 protesters in Washington, D.C., David declared, "The sun shines on a new day, and it is ours." A prolific voice on social media with more than 1 million followers, David uses his platform to promote civic engagement, activism, and voting. As a speaker, he informs, challenges, and energizes, empowering his generation to resist apathy and become catalysts for positive social change. "People call us snowflakes," he once tweeted. "What happens when snowflakes vote? That's called an avalanche." All right, the floor is yours, David. You can go ahead and take it away.
For a second, I thought you were about to say Jay-Z. I was like, no, no, no. But seriously, thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Jay. Snaps to you, snaps to everyone that's out there watching. And yeah, I just wanted to note before we begin as well that occasionally I may be looking off camera to look at my notes because this is kind of an untraditional format, and I will go on for hours at a time unless I really structure myself, as I'm sure many of you can understand as other young people. So yeah, let's get to it. Yeah, so my story really begins with the day, the day of the shooting and what happened. In the immediate aftermath of everything that happened, when I was there, my sister was there that day. She was 14 at the time. I was 17 at the time. And in the aftermath, I kind of felt paralyzed because for the first time in my life, it was, unlike the times where, for example, I'd been flying, a toy helicopter or remote control helicopter and got it stuck in my sister's hair, or, accidentally drew purposely drew a mustache on her when I was in elementary school before a picture day because I thought it was an edible marker and I thought it could, just go away. This time I couldn't just, cut the helicopter out of her hair or get the mustache off with a lot of scrubbing and toothpaste. This time it was something much more serious and something that I couldn't fix. So using my experience in speech and debate and my background in TV production and understanding this issue, having debated things like universal background checks, the idea that every gun sale in the United States, no matter private or public, should need a background check, so debating those things on both sides in speech and debate and various other topics, I knew some of the dynamics around this, and I felt a necessity to go out there and speak for those like my sister that couldn't at the time. So that's what I did is I went out there and a couple of friends and I eventually came together and discussed starting an organization called March for Our Lives, where we wanted to have a march on Washington. And in the midst of all of that, one thing that I didn't realize at the time was how the eventual exhaustion that comes from going at 1,000 miles an hour in that type of mobilization, which frankly at the time, in my opinion, was kind of obviously necessary, but also it came from a place of trauma and grief from what happened in the wake of the shooting. And one thing that I would eventually come to realize from that is the friction that change making creates. That I think a lot of people, when we look back at various movements throughout history, we oftentimes can neglect or not realize the personal cost that it had on a lot of the individuals involved in the controversy around things that we now consider very, agreed upon within society, but things that previously weren't, and how controversial they were. I think at times we forget just how hard it can be for young people to make the change that is necessary, and our youthfulness gifts us, the belief that we can make a better world and that it doesn't have to remain this way. But what comes with that is a kind of naiveness around not understanding that friction that it can create. And one of the topics that I really wanted to touch on in terms of social change making is that when you decide to go out there and make a change, no matter what it is, almost always people are going to fight against you in one way or another. They're going to disagree with you, even people within your own community at times. And that's kind of one of the first lessons that I would say is really essential in change making, which is that you need to figure out how you can redefine your community of fellow activists, organizers, and others around you, so that when you need that validation, as almost every young person that I know, including myself, needs, you can go to those people and you don't need to rely on social media or likes or retweets or anything like that, for the belief that you're valued, that you're cared for, and what you're doing is right. Because oftentimes the change that is most important is some of the most controversial at the time. Because of that, you need to have that community of friends and trusted allies and mentors around you to help redefine that community. And then the second thing that I wanted to talk about is in the aftermath of the shooting, we decided to do a road trip across the country to congressional districts where young people could help elect morally just leaders by raising their voter turnout. Previously they may have walked out of their school, and in the election in 2016, there may have been a close enough difference in the vote that if those young people just turned out at a slightly higher rate, that they would be able to change the election and elect a morally, what we call a morally just leader that believes that children should be protected and be the first priority to protect rather than inanimate objects like the AR-15 that was used at my high school. And when we did that, I think one of the things that we didn't realize is that, as we were going across the country, every day we would go out there, and most of our days would start at 6 a.m. We would start out by talking to community members about the violence and trauma that they've experienced for decades because of systemic injustice and inequality that is very purposeful in the United States. But I think what we didn't realize is the effect that can have on the individuals that are hearing those stories too. The trauma exhaustion that comes with hearing stories about generational trauma a lot of the time, and how much that can affect young people that may not have been that understanding of how it could have affected them at the time. And because of that, I think it's important to realize that when you're out there and organizing for any social cause, be it gun violence in the United States or any of the multitude of challenges that any society, be it Canada, America, or any other country faces, that self-care has to be at the core of your change making. And what that means is, for a while, I used to hear that all the time. I used to hear people come up to me like, what you're doing is amazing. And I really believe in you and your classmates, but I really want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And as a 17-year-old or 18-year-old at the time, when I heard that, I kind of thought, what does that even mean? How can I take care of myself and be selfish in that way when there are people out here every day that are, experiencing gun violence and these shootings continue to happen? Who would I be to take care of myself as all these things continue? What I didn't realize at the time is that self-care really is a necessity for change making. It can't be seen as the opposite of productivity. It has to be seen as part of productivity. And what I mean by that is my work, my method of working, even after the tour that we did across the country, and in my gap year that I spent traveling the country again, speaking to many young people like yourselves and others, doing various things for the organizations and protests, is the exhaustion that can come with change making. And for a while, I didn't understand quite how this exhaustion was affecting me. And what I didn't realize is that a lot of it came down to PTSD. And as I was traveling the country and the world, I just kind of used that as a distraction to not focus on myself and keep focusing on the mission of the organization and the mission that I dedicated myself, that my classmates had dedicated themselves as well to distract myself from really taking care of myself and just telling myself it's okay. I can just put aside, I can just act as if, hearing the stories of how people are affected by gun violence on a daily basis doesn't affect me. I can put aside the incredible amount of trauma that I've heard that may not have that was, obviously related to gun violence, but also shows how deeply rooted gun violence is in the United States, in systemic inequality, in purposeful injustice, in white supremacy, and our, at least in the United States, our obsession with militarism, and our romanticizing of violence, especially around masculinity. And the only time that I was able to start to realize that was when, I was on the road, and I didn't realize that. I guess I kind of always thought that I was just tired. I think a lot of the times, if you don't know how you're feeling, it's just like, okay, I'm just tired. I'm not getting enough sleep. But my work method that I had is a way of distracting myself from taking care of myself, and it kind of in response to my PTSD and distracting myself from it and the way it was affecting me and my brain and psychology, honestly, was working 18 hours a day most days, getting up and getting on a plane and going to a different state. I was in a gap year at the time, and speaking somewhere or organizing a protest or meeting up with organizers and talking about more of the same stuff, meeting up with people that we met with previously on tour. And I would keep doing that for months on end. Oftentimes, with a couple of friends around me, or more often than not, actually by myself. And I didn't realize that the effect that it had over time, because I would keep working 18 hours a day, telling myself, this is so important. Who would I to be put, to in some way act selfishly and take care of myself and care about myself when the mission is so important. And what ended up happening is I would work for 18 hours a day, and then I would do that for 2 or 3 months until I got so sick that I physically could not get out of bed, for a week or two at times. So at some points, to the point that I almost needed to, go to it almost got bad because of that. And I wasn't talking to my family. I wasn't talking to my friends. I wasn't checking in with them. And all of my life revolved around activism and work, just work, work, work. And if I wasn't talking about gun violence or all the issues that I've seen across the country, it didn't matter. Right. So that prevented me from talking about how I was feeling and how I was actually doing a lot of the time, because I had spent so little time actually focused on that, because I told myself that I didn't matter, and that I, was so small in comparison to the mission that I was working on, which obviously is true. But at the same time, I didn't realize that you have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. As somebody just said, it was, compassion burnout, passion fatigue as well. And I started to feel guilty. I started to think to myself, why do I feel just, not just exhausted, but like, why do I not feel motivated? Like this is such an important issue. Why is it, why does it feel like in some ways it's, destroying me doing this much? And it's because it was. And the only time that the time and moment when I actually realized that was when I started in college in my first semester after taking a gap year, and basically, not working very much after the shooting had happened, because I was traveling so much, doing so much work for the organization. And the reason why that happened is because when before I got to school, my entire schedule looked like this. I basically went in the series of about a month. I went from Florida to Switzerland for an event that I had to speak at, related to work. And then I had to go from Switzerland to, another state, and then another state, and another state, and another state. And basically at the end of the day, I had crossed 15 time zones in the matter of, a month before then, and then had to end up going to school on top of all that. And basically it was like flying into a brick wall, because I had gone from 1,000,000 miles an hour to zero, essentially. And I just had to focus on school. And it got to the point that when I was in school, I started I actually started to process some of the stuff that I was going through. And it got to the point that I was still traveling every weekend as well when I was in school, because I still had a lot of that, at least in the first half of the semester. I had a lot of that, I guess survivor's guilt and compassion fatigue left over, that I was just continuing to go every day. I was traveling, every weekend I was traveling to a different state, trying to do all my homework on planes and stuff as I was doing that, and thinking that that's possible, right? It simply wasn't. And I think sometimes we have to realize, what I realized is, it kind of got to a point that essentially I was sleeping 12 hours a day, but in reality, I was really only sleeping 2 hours a night. And it's because my sleep quality was so bad, and I was having a lot of, frankly, like flashbacks and stuff to not just the shooting, but also like the exhaustion and work that I had gone through from the work that I had gone through for the past 2 years. Because that in some ways had become, I started dreaming about it and like waking up like freaked out, imagining I was working on campaigns, and we were 6 months behind and freaking out about that. I'm just a freshman in college, right? And that's when I really decided like I need to go back to because I had gone to therapy shortly after the shooting, but I really stopped because I was focused so much on school. And that's when I really started to take things seriously. And that was the real moment, in my opinion, that I learned the value of learning how to say no to stuff. And what I mean by that is, I started realizing that I needed to put myself first and my mental health first to focus on that aspect. And I guess just to kind of help wrap that up a bit, here the main lessons that I learned from that experience, and now I've been in therapy for the past year, and I can actually sleep at night. My workload has gone down significantly because I learned how to delegate effectively. Our organization hired more people, and I'm able to focus on being a college student now and taking care of myself. I guess what I wanted to reiterate before we end, because I know this is like very short time period, was one, the importance of setting norms when you're working. That is a huge thing I didn't realize. And in that you need to proactively plan on resting before you burn out, because it's disrespectful and harmful to the movement when you're not taking care of yourself. Because in reality, if you were not taking care of yourself, these movements are made up of individuals. They're the collective action of individuals. If you were not taking care of yourself, especially as a leader, you are not doing your job as a participant and a leader in the movement, because to take care of it, because you're not taking care of yourself, because you are the movement, right? You were part of it. And if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not taking care of the movement. So you need to set times to stop before you're exhausted and burnt out, because then that starts, affecting the people around you. You may start attacking them personally, even though it may not be intentional, because you're exhausted and you're telling yourself that you have to keep going at a million miles an hour, when in reality, you don't. The fact of the matter is, social movements are not like a campaign, and they cannot be treated as such. What I mean by that is, initially, I looked at, the movement that I was working in as a marathon, or as a sprint rather, 100-meter sprint, kind of like a campaign. You have a set end date, you have a goal. Once you get there, you can collapse at the end, but you just need to go a million miles an hour at that moment. And that's just not the case. Social movements are not like a sprint. They are like an ultra marathon. They are like an ultra marathon where you were told, let me use a Canadian example. You're told to go from, Quebec City to Vancouver. Although you have no idea, what Vancouver looks like. You've seen photos of it, but you have no idea how to actually get there. But you need to get there as quickly as possible, because in the case of gun violence, people are dying every day, right? The reality is, though, you have to pace yourself. You absolutely have to pace yourself, in that you need to be prepared, not only to be prepared to not be able to continue, for the movement to outlive you eventually, because sometimes these things take centuries. You need to be prepared to make sure that you're leading as much as possible by example and treating it like the ultra marathon that it is. Then, as I said earlier, redefining your community. Call your friends. Take time out of your day to focus on doing things that you enjoy that are not related to your work. You cannot do this constantly. In fact, if you are, it ends up hurting the work a lot. So what I started doing is I started journaling every day, because what I felt in the 2 years after the shooting was I thought PTSD would make me feel sad. I thought it would make me feel anxious. I definitely felt anxious and sad at times, but really more than anything, the way that it affected me is I just didn't feel anything. I felt numb. I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I didn't smile, and all of these things affect us in different ways. And in my case, the best way of addressing that was getting back in touch with my emotions and not treating them as something that I just need to put in a box and not address and act as if they're not there, but really start to process them as they're happening. And the best way for me to do that was having a good group of friends around me that I checked in with, that I worked with. And I took the intentional effort to not talk about what we're working on. So because those friends and friendships that you have cannot solely be based around work. In fact, I would argue they need to be based almost at a spiritual level with each other. Like a brotherhood or sisterhood or, siblinghood, where you understand each other and you see each other in some ways, even though you may not be related by blood, you're related by love for each other. because that love is what makes it possible for these social movements to succeed, because they require persistence. And history of these social movements, if you look at it, it's the product of chance and circumstance. We can only know what the circumstances were around this. You have to realize though that when those chance and circumstances do come together, amazing stuff can happen, but you can't know when those stars are going to align. So you need to do stuff consistently in a proper manner and well planned out, so that when that chance does line up, you can actually have a success, to help move things forward. And then your routine is essential. Factor in self-care into your routine. Take time out of your day every single day to, at least in my case, I found it super helpful to take time out of my day to go on a walk, and just reconnect with nature. I know that's hard in Canada right now because it's like Antarctica, but going on a walk on your treadmill or whatever, or calling a friend, which is what I did every day. It was super important. Remember to drink water, eat food, and don't just put it aside, right? I see you, Ontario. That's awesome. Remember to drink water and eat food and get sleep. Schedule in your sleep and make sure that you're getting enough, because that's really the keystone of a lot of these things. Is you absolutely have to make sure that you're maintaining your sleep, or else all of it starts to fall apart. And then you need to learn how to put your ego aside and learn how to listen, and not to respond, but listen to learn, and understand that harm can both be intentional and unintentional. And understand that what matters isn't just that you apologize when things happen, but you're able to put your ego aside and realize that this is, it is much bigger than you, although you have to take care of yourself. Social movements are an act of love. And if you're not loving the people around you when you're doing them, you're not doing your job as a participant in the social movement to help make it as good as it can be. And a lot of the time that revolves around having the humility to admit that you made a mistake, and that you are not just going to promise to do better, but you will do better in the future. Last two things, delegate and plan. Do not, if you feel like everyone is coming to you constantly for everything, that is a sign of what I call the center dot syndrome. As a mentor of mine, as I learned about from a mentor of mine, you need to delegate effectively so that people, the surface area of the pressure of the movement is spread out for whatever part of it you're working on. Lastly, again, social movements are not a sprint. They are an ultra marathon. You need to be prepared to do this for the rest of your life. And if on a daily or weekly basis, you do not feel like you can continue to do this, you need to realize that you need to figure out how to reconfigure and delegate more effectively so that it's not all on you. B, how to practice your self-care more. And C, realize that you can take a step back, that you don't need to be in this constantly. It is most important that you don't just burn out after a year or two of doing this, but you're here for 20, 40 years to come, right? So that's just what I wanted to say. You must see self-care as part of the movement. And lastly, all of us want to change the world. But in order to do that, we need to be prepared for the truly awesome amount of power it takes to move the world. And I know that we can as young people, and we have before in the past, but we need to realize that and understand that this is an ultra marathon that will destroy us if we let it. And we have to be the ones to protect ourselves as we're making these movements possible. Thank you.
Everyone give a round of applause for our speaker, David Hogg, everyone. Please and thank you. Oh my gosh. I am still trying to recollect my thoughts because everything you said is truly, truly valid. And I can relate to everything in such an emotional level and a deep level, because I always think about everyone having a body. We are all bodies living on this earth, and we interact with these bodies, our beautiful, stunning bodies. And the fact that we have to make sure that we take care of our bodies and listen to our bodies is the best thing that I always think about. And you make a really great point on self-care and our movement, because our marathon that we're all running here is very, very difficult. But when we take care of ourselves, we can conquer that and be our champions of our revolution. And it is just so cool and so mind-blowing at the same time. So thank you again, David, for that. So I do have one question I actually have from our session Q&A that I would like to ask you. This is from Gabby Holt. So one of the questions was, what are some of your advocacy goals for this year?
Yeah, so I would say some of our advocacy goals for this year is really broadening the conversation more around gun violence in the United States, and expanding it to realize that, yes, gun laws are important. They do play an important factor, but we also need to acknowledge the fact that even if people are not necessarily, we need to ask, why do young people, especially in the United States, or does anyone for that matter, feel the need to pick up a gun, right? And a lot of that revolves around systemic injustice that was purposely built into the structure of our country that can be fixed over time, but needs to first of all be acknowledged. The number one predictor of where gun violence occurs in the United States is where communities were redlined, which means for your Canadians, I don't expect you all to know this, but redlining basically was a discriminatory housing policy that made it harder for people of color and ethnic minorities within the United States than in the period of 1930s or like even later on to get loans from the Federal Housing Administration, which is like a federal government program. And it basically built in a lot of economic injustice that lasts to this day. So I guess what I want to say is that in terms of advocacy, we really want to focus on not only mutual aid, which we just launched a program for. We're putting in $500,000 this year, focus on mutual aid and building out how can March for Our Lives as a national organization, and an organization of young people, led by and for young people. How can we build out how can we lead by example? Because I think there's a lot of problems, frankly, with, at least in the United States, with issues around the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that it may actually end up perpetuating a lot of these injustices. So what we're focused on is how can we not be part of that, and how can we actually work with community organizations in a true and authentic manner, not as white saviors, but as actual allies, and asking, what can we do for you? So yeah, as the last point on that, I'll say, in terms of narrative or education of people, that's a major advocacy goal. And we want people to realize that, at least in my opinion, that addressing gun violence in the United States is going to look different in every community. And realizing that about a third of gun violence, it's really not a one solution fixes everything in the United States issue. It's realizing that, a third of it is gun laws, a third of it is, purposeful injustice and white supremacy that needs to be addressed in the United States. And a third of it is our romanticizing of violence in this country and militarism that needs to be addressed, especially around masculinity. And the belief that for many young men in the United States, that they feel the need to have a gun to prove that they're a man, when almost ironically, that proves how weak they are, right? Because they're using that to hide behind, and clutch onto that, to hide their emotions. And it's just, so those are the main advocacy goals. Sorry, I go on a lot, as you can tell.
Oh, it's okay. Don't be sorry for being amazing. I think the solid point you made was like the point 3 out of those 3 points, where you said that toxic masculinity, or just in general, that masculinity is such a negative output, and we have such a romanticization of militarism, and it's just, I can't fathom that, because as a queer person, I see that, and I see, like, what am I as a man if I'm not holding a gun, if I don't have muscles, if I don't have a mustache? Does that make me less of a man? And does that make me less of a person or a human being? And you put that so nicely, because again, we are not identified by that. That doesn't.
And I think, Jay, one of the things to realize around that I've reflected on is that what makes you a man is being whoever you want to be. Right. And being proud of that. If you are a cisgendered male, or whatever you identify as, being proud of that, and not letting the constraints of society define you and the actions that you do, but letting what you want to do and what you like define it. For example, I love Ariana Grande. They're amazing, right? Like, I love listening to that. I love listening to many things that are and doing many things that may be stereotypically feminine, but I don't see that as making me any less of a man. In fact, I see it as making me more of one, because I'm comfortable with myself, and I don't feel the need for society and toxic militarism to define me, right? So I think that was a really good point that you brought up.
Thank you so much. We actually got a next question here. This is from our other MC, Emily Sather. So tell us about your experiences with dealing with adult stakeholders.
Oh God, that's a loaded question. But I would say, I think one mistake that honestly we kind of made in the beginning is, and this obviously comes from the trauma of the shooting, is believing early on that all adults were our enemy. There are many that did not want to do good things, obviously, did not have the best of intentions, but there were many, I would argue just as many, that wanted to truly just mentor us. And I would say one of the best things that you can do, at least in terms of mentorship and and bringing in people is, if you see an adult that you've worked with in the past or that going to them and asking them, because oftentimes if you're going to them and asking like for that help and they come in, they aren't coming to you. So that's it can sometimes be a good way of filtering out whether or not they have, bad intentions, because the ones that really have the worst of intentions are going to be coming to you. Not always though. Like, don't take that as it's a case by case basis, and it is complicated. But I would say, see adults the same way that you would see young people in some senses. Some of them are not going to be nice people. Some of them are going to be really great people. It's just a case by case basis. And I think the key is using their advice, not letting it solely dictate your actions, but letting it help inform you of the playing field that you're working on. Because reality is there are a lot of mistakes. I'm currently concentrating in history. I think one of the things that I've realized, especially talking to a lot of my mentors that were involved in the freedom rides and civil rights movement, is that a lot of the mistakes and issues that we see throughout these social movements are very common and have somewhat of a pattern. So by understanding those patterns and listening to our elders and mentors, we can help avoid those avoidable mistakes, so we can actually focus on the ones that inevitably come up along the way. So I guess listening for advice, but it's really it is a complicated question. I think it's something that mainly comes with experience, and understanding that not all adults are bad, the same way that not all young people are great people. It's just people in general, and it's something that comes with experience. But I think ultimately, as with anything, going with people that treat you well and you feel respected and comfortable by is a really good way to at least start with.
Exactly. And yeah, it's a valid point that like when you talk about our adult stakeholders and like they're teaching us their experiences, and like how you said you have mentors, when I think about this quote, it's like a wise man learns from their mistakes, but a wiser man learns from others. And it's like in that same way, we learn from their mistakes and we cultivate a society and a community where we can like build upon that and go like, we're not going to do that again. We're going to do it this way, and it's going to work out in a different perspective, in a different way that we can never really see. But I mean, it's just so cool because we get to work it in our own favor in a really cool aspect like that. So we actually have another question from Deborah. The question was, how do you persevere and respond to people who, for whatever reason, deny problems regarding mental health, etc., and to keep advocating even when it's discouraged by other people's responses? I'll put it in the chat for you.
Yeah. I think it's trying to focus on the people that are open to listening, because they're always going to be not always, but a lot of the time they're going to be at least some number of people that are open to listen. And eventually, by chipping away at them, and bringing them to your side, other people will feel more comfortable to come forward. Because ultimately, it's like, could I go to the NRA member that sends me death threats and try to convince like them? Sure. But ultimately, they're not the person that they're going to be one of the hardest people to convince. And they're not the person that I need to be focused on, because they don't represent the majority of people that we're trying to change the minds of. What we need to be focused on, is the random person in the United States that just wants their kids to be safe in their communities and schools on a daily basis and not live in constant fear, and realizes that it is possible to end gun violence in the United States, and knows that, we're one of the few more developed countries that really has to deal with this issue, right? It doesn't have to be this way. So I guess kind of focusing on those people that will listen and hoping that eventually those other people will come over is the best thing to do. But first, I guess in a weird way, focus on your first course of social change meals instead of trying to go to like the very end or whatever. But yeah, that's what I would say. And those experiences of convincing the people that are more, I guess we could say, moderate or whatever, more open, can help educate us to eventually get to a place where things, where we can help to change the minds of other people that are harder to convince. Exactly. And luckily, we have time as young people in some senses to do that. And ultimately, at the end of the day, as a generation, being young in some ways offers just as many challenges as it does opportunities, because we get to set the narrative for a generation in part. And those people that we may be trying to convince may be stuck in their ways just because that was, how things were for the past, 100,000 years, whatever it may be. Ultimately, and this is kind of morbid, we're going to outlive them. And it's about what world do we want to create for our children, right? Because eventually we have the possibility of not being those people in the future.
That's so true. Honestly, I keep thinking about that. Like we're setting up our next generation that's going to be coming up, and a lot of people are like hesitant. I know my friends are hesitant to have kids because they're like, why would I want to bring them into society that's this toxic? And I'm like, it's up to us to be able to make that society better and positive and brighter for our children that are going to be living in it soon. And I think it's people should be looking towards that instead of seeing like, okay, this is so bad right now, because it can be so much better. Right.
Yeah.
Also, we have a passing the mic going to, I believe, Amanda Tanner. So if we can get that set up. And while we're getting Amanda Tanner set up for her passing the mic, oh, wow. Thank you so much. Amanda, what is your question that you want to ask David today? She can't unmute. We'll wait for a second there.
Perfect. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome. David, I just want to say it's such a privilege to talk to you. I also had the privilege to talk to one of your teachers like 2 years ago, and just hearing from you guys and the trauma and everything is just, wow, y'all are strong in your community. It blows my mind. I'm sure everyone can agree. So my question to you though is, clearly your teacher, your community didn't ask for the trauma you've been through, right? You had goals before this happened to you, and life as well. We're in our 20s, we have bills to pay, we have things going on. How do you balance, the movement that you want, to take it all the way, and yet you still have, the life that you want? And clearly I think you can have those intersect, but how do you find that balance? Is there resentment sometimes that you get, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
I hope that's a concise.
Yeah, I think part of it is realizing that, right now I don't necessarily know what I want to do with the rest of my life. Obviously, like I care about gun violence prevention, obviously, but there are a lot of other issues that matter too. And I think it's, at least in my case, part of it has come with realizing that it's fine not to know exactly what that path forward looks like. Most of us are college students at the time. This is the time when we kind of hopefully figure that out. But also, I know plenty of adults that's, maybe 60 or 70 that are mentors of mine and still claim to not know what they want to do with their lives, right? But I've led incredible legacies of activism, of journalism, and various other things. And I think in regards to the resentment and criticism, that's kind of the community friction that I was talking about. Because the reality is trauma, I wouldn't say it destroys a community, but I would say it severely harms it in many ways. And when you're on the vanguard of, with your friends of trying to create that change, you need to figure out how to redefine that community, because, you may have neighbors that do not agree with you. You may have family members that do not agree with you vehemently. And you need to figure out how can you redefine that kind of circle of trusted people in your own community to get over that. And I would say as well, there's two other things. One is that getting off of social media is essential, in my opinion. Like just deleting Twitter. I actually think Twitter in some senses has been, it can be very productive for mobilization and talking about these things, but it also is really harmful. No one is supposed to know what everyone else thinks about them, especially thousands of other people. And at the same time, like, we're all young people, and many of us say things that we may regret later on, but because the internet is forever, those intentions can be misconstrued very easily. And it's easier, even on our own side, for the movement to be obsessed with purity, frankly, in a way that's really harmful. Because as young people, we are constantly learning. And young people especially, not that this is an excuse, but they make a lot of mistakes. We make a lot of mistakes, and it sucks. It hurts. It's really hurtful a lot of the time. But that's part of being a young person and learning about these things. And the important thing is we're doing these things now. Past generations, oftentimes, not always, but a lot of the time. And I think this is part of the reason why at least the United States is where it is right now. They waited. Not always, but a lot of them waited, or a lot of them burnt out because of the trauma that comes with being involved in these movements. And now we have people like Donald Trump eventually that come into office, and others that just, clearly didn't learn that humility and respect for other human beings when they were growing up. And I think a lot of that learning comes from making those mistakes and understanding that movements have to be transformational, loving, and educational. And if we're not open to having that humility to accept other people, in terms of when they do make mistakes and things like that. We're never going to be able to convince the other people that are even more on the outside, that are not directly involved in the movement and oftentimes proclaim to hate the movement or proclaim to hate this change. And it's tough to realize that, but that's the reality in my opinion. And what matters mostly is, what do they do afterwards? Because sometimes we can't continue working with people if they continue to do harmful actions, and that does happen. But ultimately, we have to try to give everyone that due process and try to transform and learn along the way. And that discourse just doesn't happen on Twitter, in my opinion. It's really harmful. And the last thing is that I'm trying to think, just taking time for yourself and focusing on things not related to activism is just as important as doing activism too, because it will eat you alive. And you have to figure out how to rejuvenate yourself so that you can do this for years to come. But I mean, that's just my opinion.
Thank you for that question, Amanda. And thank you, David Hogg, for that very, very amazing response. We are going to close it off for today, but I just wanted to end off on the note that you have inspired us and opened up a lot of doors and a lot of opportunities for us to delve into what we are as mental health advocates. And we are thankful and we are truly just amazed. And if you all can just say thank you on the chat, thank yous and all the claps and all the love, we love that. And we know that we are the movement, as you just mentioned, and we can redefine that we can be transformational, loving, and educational in our advocacy. And so with that being said, everyone, please thank David Hogg.
And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate all of you. And yeah, I really do think, I mean, not only that we can, but we have to be the generation that frankly saves the world from climate change and so many of these other things that our generation faces, but everyone before us, in some ways learned at minimum to survive. And I think we will too. But we don't just want to survive, we want to thrive, and I think we can. So thank you to Jack.org for having me. Thank you, Jay, for being an amazing host and being so validating. And thank you to all the amazing people in the comments and everybody on the technical side and in the organization as a whole for having me. I loved speaking to you all. And yeah, I hope you're well.
All right, thank you so much, David. And to continue off, we're going to invite our other MC of the afternoon. We have Emily Sather, the other network